Imagine buying an old guitar for a couple $100, playing it for years, and then discovering that you had unknowingly been holding a piece of Beatles history. Now imagine learning that the same guitar once belonged to John Lennon, and that decades later, it would sell at auction for $2.41 million. That is the unbelievable story of John Lennon's 1962 Gibson J-160E. And what makes this story even more remarkable is that the guitar disappeared for more than 50 years before anyone realized where it had gone. It all started in September 1962, when the Beatles were still at the beginning of their journey toward becoming the biggest band in the world. John Lennon purchased a Gibson J-160E acoustic electric guitar from Rushworth's Music House in Liverpool for about £161. George Harrison purchased an almost identical guitar around the same time. At that moment, nobody could have known just how important Lennon's guitar would become. The Beatles were recording constantly, writing songs, performing live, and developing the sound that would eventually change popular music forever. Lennon's Gibson became one of the instruments associated with that extraordinary period. It was used during early Beatles recording sessions, including work connected with songs such as Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You. Sources also connect the guitar with several other early Beatles recordings and songwriting sessions. But the guitar's importance wasn't simply about the songs recorded with it. Lennon and Paul McCartney also used guitars during their songwriting process, and the J-160E became part of the creative environment in which some of the Beatles' greatest early songs were developed. Then came December 1963. The Beatles were performing at the Finsbury Park Christmas show in London. The band was already becoming a phenomenon, and thousands of fans were eager to see them. But somewhere around that concert, Lennon's Gibson disappeared. The guitar had been stolen, and that was the beginning of a mystery that would last for more than 5 decades. Lennon eventually replaced the missing instrument with another guitar. Meanwhile, the original Gibson had apparently slipped completely out of the Beatles' world. For years, nobody knew where it was. There was no dramatic public recovery. No famous collector announced that they had discovered it. The guitar simply disappeared into ordinary life. And that is what makes the next part so incredible. Several years after the theft, the guitar somehow ended up in San Diego. In 1967, it appeared at a local music store known as the Blue Guitar, according to accounts of its rediscovery. A young musician named Tommy Presley, who played bluegrass and worked as a carpenter's apprentice, bought it for about $175. And Presley had absolutely no idea what he had purchased. To him, it was simply an interesting old Gibson. There was no obvious sign saying, "This belonged to John Lennon." So the guitar continued its quiet second life. A couple of years later, Presley needed money because he was preparing to move to Northern California. He sold the guitar to his childhood friend, John McCaw. McCaw also had no idea that he was buying one of the most historically significant guitars in rock music. According to accounts of the story, McCaw paid roughly $175 for it. And then something extraordinary happened. Nothing. For decades, McCaw simply owned the guitar. He played it from time to time, particularly for bluegrass and country-style music. Sometimes it hung on a wall. Sometimes it was kept away. Imagine that. A guitar connected to John Lennon and the Beatles was sitting in an ordinary San Diego home, while the world had no idea where it was. For more than 50 years, the mystery remained unsolved. Then, eventually, someone noticed something. McCaw's guitar came to the attention of Mark Introvaya, a guitar instructor who knew McCaw. Introvaya was familiar with Beatles history and knew that Lennon had once owned a Gibson J-160E that had disappeared. That led to a much bigger question. Could this ordinary-looking Gibson actually be Lennon's missing guitar? The problem was that there are plenty of Gibson J-160E guitars. Simply owning the same model wasn't enough. The guitar needed to be authenticated. That is where Beatles gear expert and author Andy Babiak became involved. Babiak had extensive knowledge of the Beatles' instruments, and he began examining the guitar. One of the most important clues was the serial number. The serial number matched the number associated with Lennon's missing guitar. But that still wasn't the only evidence. Experts also examined the guitar's physical characteristics, including its wood grain. The combination of the serial number, wood grain, and other identifying characteristics provided powerful evidence that the guitar was, in fact, Lennon's long-lost instrument. Suddenly, John McCaw wasn't simply the owner of an old Gibson. He had been unknowingly living with a piece of Beatles history. Think about that for a moment. For decades, McCaw had been playing a guitar without knowing that John Lennon had once held the same instrument. The discovery completely transformed the meaning of the guitar. It wasn't just an old Gibson anymore. It was an artifact from one of the most important periods in popular music. And now there was another question. How much was it worth? Initially, the auction house estimated that the guitar could sell for somewhere between $600,000 and $800,000. That was already an astonishing amount of money for a guitar that had originally cost Lennon about £161. But nobody knew just how high the bidding would go. Before the auction, Beatles fans had the opportunity to see the guitar publicly. Its story attracted enormous attention because it wasn't simply a famous musician's instrument. It was a lost artifact that had somehow survived decades of uncertainty before being discovered in an ordinary collection. And now, in November 2015, the guitar went under the hammer at Julien's Auctions in Beverly Hills, California. Here's the question I want you to answer. If you had bought this guitar for $175 and later discovered it once belonged to John Lennon, would you keep it forever or sell it for millions? Tell me your answer in the comments. Because what happened next was unbelievable. The bidding didn't stop anywhere near the original estimate. The final price reached $2.41 million. A guitar that had once been purchased for roughly $175 by someone who had no idea of its history had become a multi-million-dollar piece of rock and roll memorabilia. The anonymous buyer paid the extraordinary amount at the November 2015 auction. The sale also carried a charitable element. Half of the proceeds were designated for the Spirit Foundation, the charitable organization founded by John Lennon and Yoko Ono. And suddenly, the guitar's entire journey came full circle. John Lennon had bought it in Liverpool in 1962. He used it during the Beatles' extraordinary early years. It disappeared after a Christmas concert in 1963. It somehow made its way to San Diego. A young musician bought it without knowing its history. He later sold it to John McCaw. McCaw owned and played it for decades. Then experts connected the instrument to Lennon through its identifying features. And finally, more than half a century after it disappeared, the guitar returned to the spotlight, this time with a price tag of $2.41 million. But perhaps the most fascinating part of the story isn't the money. It's the fact that the guitar survived at all. The people who owned it for decades didn't know they were preserving a piece of music history. They weren't famous collectors. They weren't running a museum. They simply had a guitar. And hidden inside that ordinary-looking instrument was a connection to John Lennon and the Beatles at the beginning of their rise to worldwide fame. That's why stories like this are so fascinating. A priceless piece of history doesn't always look priceless. Sometimes, it looks like an old guitar hanging quietly on someone's wall. And sometimes, the person holding it has absolutely no idea what they have. John Lennon's Gibson J-160E disappeared in 1963. More than 50 years later, it resurfaced. And when the auctioneer finally brought down the hammer in 2015, that forgotten guitar had transformed from a $175 purchase into a $2.41 million piece of rock history. So the next time you see an old guitar sitting in a corner, remember this story. Because you never know what history might be hiding in plain sight. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories from the world of classic rock, legendary musicians, and the priceless objects behind music history. And don't forget to like the video and share it with another Beatles fan.